Bonjour à tous.
Good afternoon, everybody. We're delighted to have you for this session organized on the topic Europe facing the world. In partnership with Normandy region and the Forum for Peace, I am actually the vice head of the, deputy head of the Regional Council. So we'll spend the next 55 minutes discussing the topic that actually we could go on talking about for hours, days, years. Europe facing the world. So to tackle this in 55 minutes, let's try and be organized. And just by way of introduction, maybe a quick word to try and decide what we're going to talk about. So for decades, Europe has actually shied away from its relationship with the world. It seemed it was not at the heart of what Europe was about. Of course, Europe was built after World War II, but also the construction of the EU, its single market, and then it extended gradually. But for a number of years now, there have been at least 5 systemic crises: the 2008 financial crisis, the climate crisis, the health crisis, COVID pandemic, that has prompted pretty strong responses from the European, and also a security crisis with migratory flows and imminent threats on the borders of Europe. What all these crises have in common is that they actually compel Europe not to shy away anymore from questioning its relationship with the world. And if Europe does not develop a new way to relate to the rest of the world, then it stands threatened with extinction. And another common denominator between all these crises is sovereignty. How can one win their independence? How can Europeans be real masters of their fate? How are they to position themselves towards other powers in the world, current powers, emerging powers, past powers? It's not only the states that now have the preserve of power. Private corporations are powerful. Space conquest also comes with a certain power, which calls into question the future of Europe. So this new European era that we're going to talk about. What does it mean? What does it entail for economic stakeholders, for political decision makers? And it begs 3 questions with regards to how Europe relates with the world. Is Europe isolated? In other words, can Europe find allies in the way it promotes its values, or is it going against the grain? Second question, is Europe sufficiently united? If it is united, is it going to prove sustainably so, or is the threat of divisions going to prove stronger than its unity? And last question, is it credible? Does it have the means of its ambitions? Can it promote policies with the actual wherewithal to implement them? So many questions indeed, to tackle them today and to share their insight. It is my pleasure to welcome Jörg KUKIES, who is Secretary of State of the German Chancellery. So yeah, round of applause, why not? Sitting next to him, Guillaume KLOSSA. Well, he wears several hats. He's the founder of Europa Nova, a European think tank, and also the head of MedTech, of a MedTech called T-Life. He's also given a lot of thought on Europe, and he's just published a book, a small blue book. You know, there was such a thing as the small red book. but it's called the Blue Book, and he will actually sign his book at the bookshop here at 4 o'clock. Reflecting on the future of the EU and the overhaul of European treaties, because to think about the future of Europe, it probably implies rethinking treaties and the European Constitution. Sitting next to him, Jean-Louis Giraudolle is the head of the French department of LAYA Frères. He'll talk us about the political aspects and financing aspects. To my right, Arancha González LAYA, former Foreign Affairs Minister, and more recently became Dean of the International Affairs Department at Sciences Po School. So really also very much at the heart of thinking on Europe. And online with us, Ms. Tytti TUPPURAINEN. Thank you for being here, Madam. You will tell us about the recent developments of politics in your country, and of course your relationships with the EU and the prospect of your entering NATO. Welcome to Aix-en-Provence from your country, Madam Minister. So feel free to speak your mother tongue. We have headsets for people in the audience. So that we're a bit organized here, we are going to focus on three main strands. Firstly, the question of European taboos that are being debunked. So what's happening, what's at stake. Then we'll talk economy, financing and sovereignty. And finally, third focus, the role of Europe amongst other nations and the question of the security of Europe and European citizens. But without further ado, I'll give the floor to Mr. Jörg KUKIES, who's Secretary of State of the German Chancellery, because your Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, talk us about the turning point for Europe, a turning point also for Germany, on a number of directions in the European policy that Germany has developed. So what are these taboos that are about to fall? I'll try to speak French, but I hope you don't mind if I shift to English if it becomes a bit too complicated for me. You talked of turning points and taboos. Well, I think Russia's attack on Ukraine has probably triggered a lot of reflections. At first, Germany, as it is traditionally, was very conservative and reserved the right to,
So delivering arms, delivering weapons into crisis zones and war zones like the one that we're seeing as a consequence of the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. Germany traditionally was, due to its history, very careful not to show involvement. And now I think that has changed very fundamentally. So that's le premier tournant.
So that was the first turning point.
The amount of engagement and the threat that we perceive. And certainly, if anything, Germany has gotten over the past decades a bit too complacent in terms of the military and security threats that we have. So certainly Germany has dialed back its defense expenditure quite substantially as a percentage of our GDP. The German parliament just recently changed our constitution to allow us to spend 100 billion euros over the next 4 years in order to attain the goal of aligning with the NATO 2% target, and it will be a big tournoi massif pour notre système militaire.
So that's a major turning point for our military system.
Very serious investments into our military. And of course, it sounds a lot already, but if you look at the true numbers, it'll show you how significant this is. So far, we've spent, of the 50 billion of defense budget, Germany has spent about 40 billion in maintaining our services and 10 billion into new investments. The 100 billion split over 4 years, so the 25 per year will go directly into new spending. So the expenditure line will go from 10 billion currently into 35 billion, and that will help us to achieve a certain congruence with France, with the United Kingdom, with other NATO countries to which we want to align. Because as we're seeing right now, the biggest limiting factor to our ability to support Ukraine more militarily is the lack of available systems that we have. So that's certainly a big change that we've had. The second big thing is, of course, energy. Energy certainly is something that is also, as we're seeing constantly now and being reminded, a geostrategic issue. Germany has become too dependent on Russian coal, on Russian gas, and on Russian oil. The numbers were quite staggering. We were above 50% of dependence on Russia, and of course with gas that's the most striking. Coal is the easiest to substitute, but we're in a massive process now of moving away from our path of going from fossil to renewables, which is an ambition that we continue to have, but of sidestepping that by going from fossil, very reliant on Russia, to fossil, non-Russian, but at the same time making all of the investments that we need to massively increase wind energy, both onshore and offshore, and to massively increase solar energy. So that will change, and just to give you a sense of the numbers, in 2030, 80% of our electricity will be produced by wind and solar. The amount of electricity that we will use will go from currently roughly 600 terawatt hours to 1,500 to 1,800. And the fraction of that being deployed by renewables will increase from currently about 30% to 80%. So the amount of investment that's required from that is very, very massive. So it's good that we have financial expertise on the panel that can help us deal with that. And the third one is technology. So I think in all of these areas, we are very, very pro-European. So the first pillar on the defense spending, one of the key things that is in the legislation changing our constitution and implementing the defense fund is a coopération très intense avec la France et avec le
very intense cooperation with France and Europe.
Policy is to have a European strategy to increase interconnection, to move away from bypassing Europe through Nord Stream 2 and going into building LNG terminals together with countries that don't have access to the sea. We just agreed with the Czech Republic, with Slovaks, with Hungary to work very closely together on that so that we can together move away from dependence on Russian oil and gas into a pan-European strategy. And of course, that's also extremely important for the third pillar, namely digitization and technology. The EU Chips Act, which was brought forward by Thierry Breton, is enormously important. It's also enormously important that 1 month after Thierry Breton announced the EU Chips Act, already the first huge investment of 33 billion by Intel into a semiconductor investment was announced and distributed between France, Germany, and Italy. So I think that's also a sign that things are moving and that semiconductors, where we've so far been massively reliant on the US and China, is something where the EU wants to develop its own capacity. Of course, that'll take time, that'll take a long number of years, but both Germany and France are working together on promoting that and pushing it forward.
Merci Jörg KUKIES, vous venez de le dire.
Thank you very much, Jörg KUKIES. You did say so. It's going to take time, but everything seems to be speeding up. All those evolutions are very fast. And Guillaume KLOSSA, you've given a lot of thought to all these topics. Europe is at a turning point. Do you think that Europe is reaching, willy-nilly, a sort of coming of age? And would you say that it's past its childhood and teenage years and it has to tackle the real big topics now? Europe was built on the basis of skills that are sometimes, or prerogatives that are now claimed by some states again, but there were some shared prerogatives. And we see now that there's a need for more convergence if we want to succeed. So where are we at? Is it a turning point? Is it a milestone? And how do we not miss out on that opportunity? Well, thank you very much for the very simple question. Well, you have 4.5 minutes to tackle it. Well, I won't say that I'm delighted to be joining this panel discussion since this very hard question is put to me. But since I'm wearing two hats, so I have both I am going to speak as an observer and a practitioner, is that there is a real resurgence and rekindling of the European Union, and we're in the throes of a crisis. That's true, that's undeniable, but crises have always helped us move forward. Remember, the USSR at the end of the 80s, they were in a big crisis and they collapsed. The US are also facing a major crisis and it is in peril. But the EU has one asset, which is that it has a lot of flexibility and a very smart organization. I think Europe and the idea of the European Union was born during the war. I think really very early days were in the 40s, and the Rome Treaty, November 1950, was the absolute foundation with fundamental rights. Then there was coal and steel, when you're a child, you need protection, and back then we needed the protection of the US. But then the Berlin Wall fell, the USSR collapsed, and then there was the 1992 treaty, and those were our teenage years, and that translated into crises, which is only fitting. When you're a teenager, you go through crisis, but it's a way of building character. We're entering adulthood, which is to say that we've learned the rules, but we know how to move beyond rules and to take responsibility for our actions. And I think we are at the crossroads. Europeans need a framework and need rules, but those rules are not sufficient. They need to learn how to act and react, but also anticipate and foster a number of things. This is where we're at in terms of the EU. Just 3 quick comments about this turning point. I don't know if it's a real turning point, but I think there's something happening in terms of our civilization. Europeans together, and maybe thanks to the crisis in Ukraine, realized that it was their very identity that was at stake. In March, it was clearly said that and what Zelensky said is that the Europeans are responsible for defending a number of values, defending human dignity, fighting those who think that strength can prevail over respect, gender equality, equality between states, cooperation with a common rule rule of law, a certain vision of the way you relate to the world, which is really a determining factor in our approach to policies. We've reached some of the limits of sovereignty, the environment, and it's this that model where we've reached the limits of part of that model, and faced with India and Russia, the point is for Europeans to find out whether we can build our own narrative, and which is what we need. And to talk about markers, to be very hands-on. Well, can you be brief, please? Yes. Well, when, for example, the EU signed the Green Deal, it means that you are really in the vanguard and on the first line. Well, that's a marker. Putting technologies to the service of mankind. This is also a civilizational marker. When there's an agreement on the obligation of minimum service in member states, which is about putting, people and social needs at the heart of everything. It's also about defense, it's also about energy, but it's also the capacity to bring Brexit to an end, to be through with it. And by saying that Ukraine is now a candidate to EU membership, we send the clear message that Europe is ready to expand some more, which is very important on a symbolic level. And whatever we decide to call our, EU common policy, but we need to foster a community with those who are around us, for collective intelligence, to foster more mobility, to brainstorm together and solve our problems. This is about having a positive and extensive vision of the world, and that's very important. And the last turning point has to do with democracy. There was this conference on the future of Europe, 1,000 citizens that had just, been drawn randomly. Well, they decided that Europe had to really embody democracy, a real European democracy. This is what we need to build, which implies revision of treaties, bearing in mind all the game changers in terms of economy, democracy, and this is a pressing matter. We can't waste or squander the next 20 years. This world around us is changing fast, and that's no news. Things have always gone faster and faster. So the die is not cast, but as Machiavelli put it, if we do not anticipate and look ahead, then we might lag behind. Well, we talked about the necessity of building some industries and strengthen some sectors. This is about achievements, but to achieve all of that, you need financial resources. We have a banker amongst us, GIRODOLLE. Let's be very practical about this. Guillaume KLOSSA talked about crises and progress that's been made thanks to these crises. The organization of the banking sector in 2008. Is the EU fully equipped? And how can we act fast to finance these big mutations in the industry, conquer our sovereignty in a very tight time frame, because we need gas for next winter? So I apologize, we're going to talk money, so it is bound to be less lyrical and less lofty than what Guillaume just said. Well, we'll measure it by seeing how much applause you get. Well, I'll rise to the challenge. So if we look at the economy, finance and monetary aspects, well, Europe is a rich continent. That's the first thing I'd like to say. We have a structural excess of current account. If we look at trade, we have an excess, which is not the case of US. US had an excess, used to have an excess of a current account. They are currently at minus 3.5. Europe used to have excess of 3%, and it's still around 2.5% of GDP in terms of excess current account. So we find ourselves having the means of our ambitions. So this excess, that's $350 billion. And of course, that's greatly in part due to Germany, 8% excess. But France is at minus 1% of GDP when it comes to the current account. So this is an opportunity because, capital is becoming more and more expensive with the rise of interest rates. So we have the means of our ambitions, but we need a certain number of tools and intermediaries, which of course raises the question of banks. Banks are at the heart of it. They're crucial because financing of companies in Europe goes through banks a lot more than in the US. In US, capital markets represent 80 to 90% of financing of companies. In Europe, banks still represent a big chunk. So banks are really central to the problem. Following the financial crisis, Basel III regulations, banks have made progress. They've strengthened their equity, their solvency, their liquidity, have all been improved. The bad-performing loans have been done away with, and actually, that was demonstrated when, during the COVID pandemic, there was a need to inject liquidities into the economy with the support of the ECB and of the the guaranteed loans. But over and above that, banks have lent a lot of money to French companies and European companies. And the EU and all its institutions have proven up to taking initiatives to injecting financing and earmarking budgets on a number of initiatives to push for European sovereignty. I'm thinking of Rescue EU, Repower EU, and the Strategic Compass, and a number of initiatives that were taken. All of this falls under within the framework of something that is a bit more traditional, and Mr. KUKIES and Guillaume mentioned Next Generation EU, with 750 billion, of which 390 are grants that are allocated to countries not on the basis of their weight, but on the basis of their needs. And that's a first with a redistribution effect. Inside a real optimum monetary area, and that plan is based on up to 800 billion euros worth of common debt, based on common resources, future carbon tax, and taxing multinationals on the digital economy. So a whole series of positive signs that are very encouraging indeed, and that would go to show that Europe has given itself the means of its ambitions. Having said that, we should not disregard a few matters for concern that I would put under the heading fragmentation risks. There are still banks in Europe that are not as profitable as US banks, and really not at all as much. There are still 1,500 banks in Germany, 400 in Italy, 400 in France, so they're smaller than US banks. Much fewer pan-European banks, and those that actually work across borders are not as strong in other countries. Interest rates have gone down for a longer period in Europe compared to the US, but there are other factors that have to do with Basel regulations that includes capital requirements that are very stringent indeed, and that can be to the detriment of growth and can be to the detriment of banks growing to bigger sizes. And both on a European level and locally. It makes it difficult for liquidity to circulate. So having powerful, independent, sovereign banks is part of our economic sovereignty and also determines allocation of capital. Christine Lagarde mentioned it a few minutes ago, the question of the union of capital markets, and it's under her aegis that I would respectfully put that forward. So the capital market union is still very imperfect. It is absolutely essential to ensure good allocation of capital and also to ensure more resilience to asymmetrical conflicts or war. For example, gas does not, the crisis around gas does not impact us all on an equal footing. So compared with the US, we have investment funds and venture capital funds that are way smaller. We have a number of challenges that we have to tackle, and if we fail to tackle them, that could really endanger our future. With the rise of rates, the spread has been impacted, and the central bank, the European Central Bank, with I'm thinking of Ms. Schnabel's speech and the announcement that was made of an anti-fragmentation tool, which still raises a number of questions and still a number of uncertainties, but all of that will not be feasible single-handedly by the ECB. So if the European plan, Next Generation EU is supposed to go until 2027, it is a fairly pooled, mutualized, and very sort of federal in inspiration. Measures that were taken during the crisis that were good measures, will they not remain as exemption, but will they be prescient?
Et vous êtes applaudi.
And you have a round of applause. So the bet has been won. You talked about powers when comparing also the European landscape of banks with the American one. And indeed, this is the matter of power is at the heart of the role of Europe throughout the world. For decades, we've talked about Europe as an economic giant, about the powerlessness of Europe, and as was said earlier, about the civilization project. We seem that we're a bit naive. It seems to be the question between law and force. And the EU seems to be a community of law, but it's complicated to exist in a world where sometimes we want to do everything, and we need to go over and beyond the law. So on the international forum, how can Europe promote this unique feature facing Europe, facing America, facing China? How can Europe make its voice heard when we have a multilateralism which seems to be going back? And we need to rethink ourselves, right? It's a vast subject. I'll start to tackle this subject, starting by Europe as not an acrobat, but rather as someone on the thread, really. We need to find three balances. First one, we need to find a balance between geoeconomy, which is a project which inspired the European Union, a balance among these projects which are theirs, which creates interdependencies. And when we create such interdependencies, we manage to manage power relationships. But this is in a world where this geoeconomy needs to strike the right balance with geopolicy. I don't think that we should renounce this project in Europe, namely this project for peace. We need to be better prepared for war. That's the thing. Because what we have is that we have war being back. Unfortunately, we've had wars in the past, terrible wars, and these wars have inspired the European Union. We need to be better weaponized in the face of war. We need to be more digital. We need to decarbonize our economy in a better way, but we also need to invest more and better in defense and security. Once again, without losing sight of the fact that the EU is a project for peace, and that should be an inspiration for other regions of the world that looks into this European mirror. We need to strike the right balance to defend Europeans and Europe in a better way. When we talk about protection, we do not talk about protectionism. And it doesn't mean either that we should isolate the European Union. This is why I would like to warn the European Union against notions that seem very nice, like friendshoring or decoupling, but in reality, they imply isolating the European Union from friends, from others. And we don't know who the friends are, because sometimes we got surprises when we talked about friends. We need a European Union that can protect its citizens without closing up. That means that the European Union needs to be able to weave alliances with others. Third balance that needs to be struck, and that's the most difficult one. A balance not to have to choose between the US on one side and China on the other side. This balance doesn't imply that we need to have an equidistance, because we are and we shall remain very close to the United States, because we have the same reality, the same principles, democracy, the protection of human rights, the state of law, the rule of law. But we also know that to be able to respond efficiently to our challenges such as climate change, the financial instability, we cannot isolate China. We cannot be against China. And this is why we need to find space for cooperation and international dialogue. We're not naive. It's not because we're naive. No, we're not. It's because we have understood that the most efficient way to protect Europeans is to create spaces for cooperation. We need to have multilateralism, as François-Xavier mentioned it. It's not really fashionable right now, but we have to continue to insist upon that concept, to promote it, and to continue to help, because that's the guarantee that we can tackle subjects that could not be tackled otherwise by having countries pitted against other countries. We need opening, we need the capacity to weave alliances, to have a project for peace, but also to be equipped as well against war. And there's also this notion, of course, of balance, which is at the very heart of the European philosophy in terms of consistency, stability. When we talk about balance, it's a matter of stability. And clearly, we have a huge upheaval now because we do not have stability anymore. And for one country, it's actually even more important. That's Finland. We have with us the Minister of European Affairs of Finland, Tytti TUPPURAINEN, who's been following us from the beginning of this debate, to talk about what was said earlier. We have taboos that are being completely destroyed. And in Finland, we have a taboo that has been destroyed in Finland because you're joining the NATO. This is a decision that was made. This ratification process, which is pending. The subject matter today is to reinvent the architecture of European safety, to preserve peace within the European borders, but also to create a new policy of neighborhood. How did you live this in Finland? what is also the public opinion? How come it evolved so quickly about European safety further to what happened in Ukraine?
Alors, on va demander un retour son parce qu'on ne vous entend pas.
We cannot hear you, unfortunately. We cannot hear you. Can the public hear you in the headsets? Well, there seems to be a technical problem.
Can you hear me now?
On vous entend,
Voilà.
Madame la Ministre. Voilà.
We can hear you now, Minister.
Yeah. Thank you, dear friends. I will answer your question very soon, but let me start first with a few observations on the current situation and allow me to touch upon capitalism. As we follow Russia waging war in Ukraine, we must recognize our habit to avoid harsh truths. There always seems to be hope over experience. We did not take it seriously when President Putin declared already back in 2005 that the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe in the 20th century. We did not pay attention to war in Georgia, the annexation of Crimea, or warfare in eastern Ukraine. It is still hard to accept that the liberal order is seriously challenged, that there are great powers that do not accept a system of relatively free trade, respect for human rights, and peaceful cooperation between states. It is especially hard for us Europeans because the European Union, as a European peace experiment, is such a sharp contrast to preceding period of wars and totalitarianism. Now, history does not repeat itself, but it has long-term development paths. Sometimes today's state of affairs can be seen as a deviation from these long-term developments. And if tyranny and war have been part of European history, so perhaps the past decades of peace and democracy have been an exception, and perhaps a new Cold War is the best we can accept. However, history lessons should inspire us instead of scaring us to defeatism. The period of Cold War is usually seen as a frightening one. No one wishes its return. Yet, we could and should draw some lessons from that period. Above all, there was a degree of stability. There were guardrails that were not broken or threatened. For example, there was no loose talk about using battlefield nuclear weapons. Instead, a number of nuclear arms reduction agreements after another was made. Finding a new stability requires that the European Union and its citizens to accept that today's tensions will last for a long time. The Zeitenwende translates as a new era. Year 2023 will not see a return to normal in economic and political transactions between European Union and Russia. And quick fixes for economic hardships are not available. Yes, energy is expensive, and no, we cannot go on subsidizing energy use for years. Moreover, we have to recognize an ideological component in the confrontation between EU and authoritarian world powers. This is not 18th century Europe with more or less similar monarchies fighting over regime successions. Dear friends, while today capitalism as an economic system is not fundamentally challenged, there are major differences within that system. I refer to economist Branko Milanovic, who has defined two variants of capitalism. One is the liberal kind, the one that respects the rule of law, draws a line between political power form and economic decision-making in order to diminish corruption. It accepts free trade at least as an ideal. The other is political capitalism, where the political elites also dominate the economy. In that system, the capital may be privately owned, but that ownership may be taken away anytime without any due process. In that system, the concept of grand corruption has no meaning. The men in high offices are expected to enjoy unlimited economic benefits. Now, these two different capitalisms produce two different political systems. The liberal capitalism is based on political competition. The political capitalism sees such competition as harmful. The liberal capitalism enhances liberal values. The political capitalism sees citizens as part of nation state and expects them to conform to national values. Recognizing these ideological differences means that we have to take the liberal values of our system seriously. The rule of law cannot be compromised, not in any situation. Upholding human rights must be part of our policies, both domestically and internationally. While the war in Ukraine has frightened us Europeans, there are billions of people who see it as a war like any other war. We do not have to loudly repent our past sins in Africa or in Asia, but we have to keep in mind that upholding respect for universal human rights means that we see these rights truly universal. These are the rights that belong to all men and women on earth. Having said all this, I'm proud to announce that Finland is a proud member of NATO, hopefully anytime soon. So thank you so much for your support and swift ratification for those who have already done it. We will certainly bring an added value to the alliance and provide more security in Europe. Together, we will make sure that Ukraine wins the war. Thank you.
Merci, Madame la Ministre. Alors, il nous reste...
So we have a few minutes left for a few questions. You have a mic. We'll try to combine all questions and then we'll answer them in the end. Hello? It seems that we have a weakness we don't talk about a lot. The US is a federal state, but it's still a country. And then we have China. We have Europe, where we have several states that are fragmented. And we have different architectures. And I think we are naive here, and we are doing a lot of populism, and we are wasting a lot of money, a lot of time, and I think this could destroy us. So my question is, shouldn't we reinvent the governance of a new form of multilateralism? Yes. Second question in the back. Hello, I'm a geopolitologist. My question aims at provoking you, but in view of the recent events, it seems that Europe is weakening and fragmenting itself. Delivering arms is actually a lethalization of the situation, and this war was created because we did not close the door to NATO and to the EU getting close to Russia. So there's an element that we totally overlooked with COVID, the recovery plan and the Eurozone. We should actually have more budget for the Eurozone, but we used all the money for COVID, and the budget went down. So we're drifting towards an American-German alliance, also in the Mediterranean region. The threat comes from the south. We have no Russian threat. That's actually an illusion. Everybody's booing. I want to provoke you because I know that Russia will win the war and we'll have decisions to make. Mr. KUKIES will certainly answer to that question. Marion Solitis, I'm the editor-in-chief of Politico, and I have a question to Mr. KUKIES. You talked about about solidarity in Europe. We'll certainly lack gas. There was Mr. Le Breton who was talking about the subject earlier on. Are there concrete discussions between France and Berlin to talk about GDL, for instance, for natural gas, liquefied natural gas, for instance? So, the impact of the Ukrainian war, this is what it's all about, isn't it? You answer that, Guillaume, and then Jörg KUKIES, you have the floor. There are three questions, but very swiftly. On the Eurozone, my conviction is that once the Britons were away, the GDP of the Eurozone as compared to the European zone, because if we consider that Denmark and the other are out of the Eurozone, it's 90% versus 10%. So the idea is rather to see how we can make sure to have a single governance, because we can't have three systems of governance. We need to have a cohesion in this hardcore that we have within Europe. We should have a plan to do so. Because apart from Hungary, I think there's a political momentum to do so. So the idea is, how can we do that? Just as the treaty proposes it, with all the countries of the European Union. Because the economic reality is that the countries that are not in account for a small percentage of the European GDP. The other question was about democracy. We say we have to go to a new milestone of the European construction that would engage citizens more on their choice of leaders, that would be more efficient, with new skills that would be extended to a larger number of sectors, health, defense, for instance. And my conviction as to defense is the following, is that in 5 years, 6 years, the United States will actually go away from us. And so we have to be prepared to anticipate that as soon as possible. And so we have to reform institutions. We have a short-term problem, is that there's a lot of states that gave military equipment to Ukraine, and these states need new equipment, and we do not have the necessary European production to do so. Your KUKIES, you be able to answer. We have 2 minutes left, and we also have to answer on multilateralism. And how about your answer? Because the question was very provocative.
Win this war, full stop. Maybe there's a person or two in this room that wishes that, but I can only say the G7 over the weekend in Elmau was completely right. We will support the Ukraine for as long as it takes. So that I think needs to be said whenever the Russian narrative comes up. I was in Irpin when together President Macron, Chancellor Scholz, Prime Minister of Romania and Mr. Draghi, so Romania, Iohannis and Draghi were there. I saw with my own eyes the car that was brutally attacked, where one woman and her 2 children were sitting in there just driving to work. It's such full of atrocities. If you go to Irpin and you see the brutality with which the Russian army is killing innocent people, civilians, bombarding civilians indiscriminately, it is absolutely unacceptable to think that that will be rewarded. In terms of solidarity and working together, on Monday, President Macron and Chancellor Scholz agreed on exactly that, working together on all things energy. Yes, our strategies are different. The priorities on the sources of energy between France and Germany are very much different. But the one thing we agree on is we both want to become independent of fossil energy coming from Russia and eventually becoming climate neutral. And yes, we will work together massively despite all of our differences on nuclear and all of those things. So we can overcome those and just accept that both countries have different priorities and different strategies, but we will work together very closely. And finally, the European Union, I think, has become a magnet of attraction. So it's extremely interesting that in this crisis, so many countries, we were in the Western Balkans, every Western Balkan country wants to become a member of the European Union, in addition to the Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia. You saw what happened when Georgia wasn't at the highest level of priority. Immediately people go to the street and appeal for the attractiveness of the European project. It has to be reformed. Institutional reform, getting rid of unanimity and going to qualified majority is absolutely essential. We need a properly democratic Europe.
Merci Jörg KUKIES. Et le mot de la fin, vous avez 15 secondes chacun.
You have 15 seconds each to speak. I'm not going to answer to each and every question, but I would like to give a broader horizon and to follow up on the question that was asked by the provocative gentleman. When we talk about Europe facing the world, Europe needs to define its strategic interests when it comes to any country, the US, Russia, China, Africa, Turkey, United Kingdom, any country. And that's actually a daunting task. Thank you. The final word.
De la défense européenne.
So if we do not want Europe to be NATOized, then we need NATO to actually become more European or a full-fledged European institution. We actually have two options. We either have multilateralism or we have a national answer. We had a WTO meeting recently and there was an agreement. It can be a strength for multilateralism in a way that is not naive and that in a way that is more efficient. Thank you to all of you. Actually, we have exceeded our time, but it was worthwhile. Thank you for all of you.